Now it's time for The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Rachel. And, you know, I noticed that you didn't have anything to say about Omarosa. And forgive me if I'm mispronouncing her name, because I don't think I've ever discussed her publicly or privately before now. The latest news on this is that Donald Trump, president's just tweeted, Mark Burnett called to say there are no tapes of The Apprentice where I used such a terrible and disgusting word. Omarosa claiming that Donald Trump used the N-word in the making of that show and that there are tapes of that. And that has been a gigantic Hollywood rumor for so long. Mm-hmm. And now we have Mark Burnett, who refuses to release any of the tapes, apparently playing the game of allowing the president to use him as a now public certifier of something that could be better publicly certified by releasing all of those tapes.
Yes, as a factual matter, almost as a mathematical matter, that is actually true. There is also, there's some, Steve Bannon, who writes at manoblog.com, has documented the president having a particular sort of tick when it comes to talking about phone conversations that he says he has had that are conversations that didn't actually take place in real life. Mm-hmm. The president has frequently described phone conversations in detail that never actually happened. So in this case, the president asserting that he's had this very consequential phone call where he was assured of this very controversial thing should just probably be taken as a bunch of words. But Mr. Burnett, I guess, could clear that up too.
Thank you for that caution, Rachel, because now we will go through this hour awaiting the possibility of a clarification from Mark Burnett that no such phone call has ever occurred, or not, or whatever. We will see.
We will see. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, today, one of the people who follows me on Twitter, Patricia McClary, tweeted, "If you talk about Omarosa tonight, when there are 700 children still separated from their parents, then I will turn you off." But Omarosa is one of the reasons that those children were separated from their parents and are still separated from their parents tonight. Those children were separated because of the cruelty of the people working in the Trump White House, especially the president, who thought it was a good idea to separate them. Omarosa and everyone else working for the Trump presidential campaign knew they were supporting a candidate who believed that the one thing that we didn't have enough of on the southern border was cruelty. That cruelty was going to be one of the methods that Donald Trump would use at the southern border to discourage immigration. Omarosa knew that. All of the Trump campaign workers knew that. And now Omarosa proceeds with her TV interview version of her Nuremberg trial. As she does that, she wants to use the defense the world heard frequently during the Nuremberg trials of Nazis after World War II. I didn't know. I didn't know Donald Trump was a racist, she says, and now I do. 7 years ago, when Donald Trump started talking about Barack Obama's birth certificate, I said right here on this program at this hour that he is a racist. I did not know Donald Trump. I had never met Donald Trump. And I knew he was a racist because I listened to the racist things he very happily said in public then. Now, Omarosa tells us that Donald Trump told her then that he wasn't being racist when he was lying about President Obama's birth. He was just using it as a political device. Omarosa wasn't the only one who refused to call Donald Trump a racist 7 years ago. Virtually the entire political news media held their fire back then and begged Donald Trump to do another TV interview talking about the Obama birth certificate because those interviews were good for ratings. And so the Omarosa story is about what it means to be complicit and how many people in how many places are complicit in the cruelty and incompetence of the Trump White House and the Trump administration, and how they all must at some level know that they are complicit, no matter what they're willing to say now.
Yes, it is hindsight, but I will say this to you. I was complicit with this White House deceiving this nation. They continue to deceive this nation by how mentally declined he is, how difficult it is for him to process complex information, how he is not engaged in some of the most important decisions that impacts our country. I was complicit, and for that, I regret.
They are all going to have their Omarosa moment at some point. They will all eventually disown Trump, just as all the Republicans working for Richard Nixon eventually disowned Nixon in some way. Their Omarosa moment might not be as melodramatic, but it will come. Even Sean Spicer, who has chosen the opposite course and written an utterly ridiculous memoir of his time in Trump world, working for the most incompetent and ignorant president in history, Sean Spicer couldn't find a negative word to say about the president because he still works for the president on a Trump-controlled Republican political payroll. But Sean Spicer's day will come when he, too, will seek the comfort of acceptance by the majority of Americans instead of their scorn, and he will do that by turning against Donald Trump in some way, just like they all turned against Richard Nixon. The one unifying characteristic that everyone working in the Trump White House shares is that not one of them would be employed by any other White House, any other president in the jobs they have now. And that is because every one of them is the most incompetent person who has ever held the job they are currently holding, from White House Chief of Staff Kelly on down.
So the staff and everyone on the staff works for me, not the president.
That is from Omarosa's secret audio recording of her session with John Kelly when he fired her. So the delusionally incompetent John Kelly believes that Ivanka Trump works for him, that Jared Kushner works for him, that the White House press secretary works for John Kelly. Of course, no one in the Trump White House works for John Kelly. No one. John Kelly is not allowed to hire or fire anyone without Donald Trump's approval. And because John Kelly is an even more incompetent chief of staff than his predecessor, Reince Priebus, the Trump White House has become even more out of control in the time that John Kelly has been pretending that the White House staff works for him. The president, who has never found the time to explain how he will mastermind the reuniting of the children who he separated from their parents at the southern border, has found plenty of time to attack Omarosa on Twitter. And one of his tweets, he said, he knows it's not presidential to be attacking Omarosa, but he doesn't seem to realize that it was not presidential to hire her. No other White House staffer in history has ever written a memoir using secret recordings that she made of the president and others, because people like Omarosa could never get in the door of any other White House. While other presidential transition teams searched for excellence to staff the White House, it seems the Trump transition team was searching for nothing but incompetence. And so Omarosa went to work in the White House, along with people like Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller is one of the biggest cheerleaders of ripping babies out of their mother's arms in the Trump White House. It might be a tie between Stephen Miller and John Kelly as to who is more enthusiastic about separating families at the southern border in the Trump White House. And today, in Politico, Stephen Miller's uncle, David Glosser, published an eloquent essay in which he said, "I have watched with dismay and increasing horror as my nephew, an educated man who is well aware of his heritage, has become the architect of immigration policies that repudiate the very foundation of our family's life in this country." Stephen Miller's uncle pointed out that Stephen Miller might not exist today, and certainly would not be living in the United States if his family was not allowed to enter the United States in the early 20th century as Jewish refugees from life-threatening persecution in Eastern Europe. Stephen Miller is the product of what Stephen Miller condemns as chain migration. Donald Trump is also the product of what he condemns as chain migration. Stephen Miller's uncle wrote that Stephen Miller and Donald Trump have become, quote, blind to the hypocrisy of their policy decisions. But in government, where policy decisions affect the real lives of millions of real people and can create extreme suffering in those people's lives, hypocrisy can be a lesser sin than incompetence. Consider your airline pilot the next time you're on a plane. Would you be more bothered by her hypocrisy or her incompetence? Only one of those things can actually kill you. And so, yes, The policy of separating parents and children at the southern border was hypocritical for Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and for John Kelly, who was also the product of what he condemns as chain migration. But their greater sin is incompetence, and it is what will always unite them with Omarosa, who will be, at best, a footnote in historians' account of the Trump administration, because she never actually made anything happen in the Trump administration. She was, by her own account now, essentially just pure tokenism, the black person the racist had to have on the payroll and in the room to try to prove that he is not a racist. She was an enabler and a defender of the president she now calls racist, but no one cared what she thought about the policies. No one inside the White House did, if she thought anything at all about the policies. Thinking up the Trump policies and then executing the Trump policies fell to other incompetents in the Trump White House. Steve Bannon, John Kelly, Stephen Miller on immigration, and the incompetent Trump cabinet on that and other policies. Who can forget Donald Trump's Homeland Security Secretary in her confirmation hearing lying under oath about Norway?
Norway is a predominantly white country, isn't it?
I actually do not know that, sir, but I imagine that is the case.
Her white immigrant ancestors are from Scandinavia, and she actually pretended to know nothing about Scandinavia under oath, which is a level of incompetence that is hard to believe, even from a Trump Secretary of Homeland Security. And so tonight, Omarosa stands accused of incompetence, not just by those of us who always knew she did not have the competence to work in the White House, but by the president who hired her to work in the White House, the president who promised his supporters that he would not hire people like the person he has spent all day attacking.
We've got the best people.
I know the best people.
We're going to use our best people.
The best people.
The best people.
I know guys that are so good.
It's hard to rank the importance of the lies candidate Trump told, but the lie about the best people is actually one of the most important lies that Donald Trump told on the campaign trail, because in some jobs, incompetence can kill. Incompetence can destroy lives in some government jobs. And so Omarosa is today's window into the cruelty and incompetence of the Trump White House and the Trump administration. It was the hypocrisy and the cruelty and incompetence of Donald Trump and John Kelly and Stephen Miller that ripped babies out of the arms of their mothers on the southern border. And it is their rank incompetence that keeps 559 of those children still separated from their parents tonight. The Trump administration has admitted that they don't know how to reunite those families. They don't know how. And so tonight, in an administration where the only cabinet members who have publicly demonstrated any kind of real competence, our Secretary of Defense Mattis and Director of National Security Coates, we are living with the cruelty of malice and incompetence of the Trump administration. They are all Omarosa. Donald Trump is Omarosa. And everyone working for him in that White House is Omarosa. When we come back after this break, we'll be joined by Michael Steele, Yamiche Alcindor, and Tim O'Brien, who will consider what all of this means, not for Omarosa, but for all of the other Omarosas still working in the White House, very much including Donald Trump. President Trump seems to be trying to fight back against what he seems to consider Omarosa's most serious accusation against him, that she has heard him using the N-word on tapes made while they were making the TV series The Apprentice, tapes that are in the possession of some people that Omarosa would not name. And so tonight, Donald Trump has tweeted that he got a phone call from the man who owns those tapes, the man who produced that show. The tweet says, Mark Burnett called to say there are no tapes of The Apprentice where I used such a terrible and disgusting word. And joining our discussion now, Michael Steele, former chairman of the Republican National Committee and an MSNBC political analyst, Yamiche Alcindor, the White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour and an MSNBC contributor, and Tim O'Brien, the executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald, and an MSNBC contributor. And Michael Steele, I want to get your reaction to what the president is tweeting about tonight. He seems to think, or at least what you see in that, is the idea that he believes that a tape of him being caught using the N-word could be really damaging to him. What is your reading of what that would actually do to President Trump's standing?
I think if that tape existed, and just as an asterisk on that point, this is a narrative, as you know, Lawrence, that has been around for about 4 or 5 years now, and so it's come from different places and different sources. So there is that, and I think for the president, this idea that if this tape did exist, this did occur, it would be, I think, beyond devastating. To hear the president's own voice, own words, using that word, doesn't matter context, doesn't matter situation. It's going to be hard to come back from that. I think a lot of supporters of his who, as we've seen, start to move a little bit and shift, particularly around the issue that you raised in your opening, which was very powerful, by the way, this idea of complicit and incompetence. That whole issue with these children, coupled with this type of language coming out of the president's mouth, unlike the Access Hollywood tape, this, I think, has a much more devastating impact.
Yamiche, do you agree on that point? I mean, it strikes me as something that would be, if it existed, completely unsurprising to me, based on my observations of Donald Trump. And we don't have any good evidence that this exists. I don't think any of us are sitting here believing Omarosa on this point. But Yamiche, if it did exist, if it did become public, do you agree with Michael about what the impact would be?
If that tape really did exist, it would be a bombshell for the president. Unlike some other things that have happened to the president, the N-word is steeped in history. People have swung from trees. People have been enslaved. Whole generations of people were denied the right to vote. So much violence was really perpetrated on African Americans using that word, that it's a special place in American history that I think the president would have a hard time coming back from. That said, the Access Hollywood tape, when that came out, everyone was thinking, okay, this is the end of his campaign. Everyone's going to flee from him. He's going to have a really hard time coming back from it. And guess what? He bounced back and became president. So as a White House correspondent, I'm loath to say that there's going to be one thing that would take this president down. That said, Omarosa's claims that she heard him say this have obviously problems, because both of them have credibility issues. And what you have in a reality television president is all these cast of characters that kind of have their personalities and have their own agendas. And for President Trump, because he has his own credibility issues, there's not a way to 100% say, well, Omarosa clearly is wrong and she never heard that and she's 100% wrong, especially because she says that there are going to be other tapes coming out. If she has that tape and it comes out, that could be devastating.
Tim O'Brien, you are, I think, the only one among us who has had conversations with Donald Trump about Omarosa, which we'll get to in a moment. The first thing I want to check with you is something Rachel raised at the beginning of this hour, which is Donald Trump is known to publicly lie about having received phone calls from people that are either praising of him or very helpful to him in some way. And he's done it. We've seen him do it on Twitter, lie on Twitter about having gotten a phone call from someone.
A friend of mine.
Yeah, that was in some way aggrandizing to Donald Trump. What's the possibility? I mean, I guess there is some level of possibility that Mark Burnett has, in fact, not called to say any of this with Donald Trump.
That could be the case. Burnett, during the campaign, when there were rumors about compromising tapes from the set of The Apprentice floating around then, the word was that Burnett put a gag order on former Apprentice producers and staff not to leak anything. So this is consistent with that. I think the larger, what's going on here in part is that you don't have a credible narrator in Omarosa. When Omarosa was kicked off The Apprentice in the early 2000s, she went back and said that one of the contestants used the N-word against her then, and that NBC had edited it out of the show. NBC denied that. And then, even after all of that, she continued to partner with Trump on projects all the way up to the White House. But the reason this has traction is, and Donald Trump just tonight, right before we aired, he tweeted again about Omarosa, and in the same breath said he called himself a true champion of civil rights. He is anything but. Donald Trump is a 72-year-old man who has spent most of his life trafficking in racism and race baiting. He has not been a civil rights champion.
No.
And these issues have our attention through Omarosa because we could believe it to be true, though I don't think we should believe her.
Michael Steele, go ahead.
No, I think that last point is absolutely right. You know, this 72-year-old man suddenly being a champion of civil rights, when you look at his history and certainly his recent history, I mean, he can't even get out in front of Charlottesville and talk to the nation from that championship perspective of civil rights about what this means to the country and why, in particular, African Americans are so repulsed by his reaction to it. So, you know, spare me that particular river. There's no one crying over that one. So let's move on and deal with the fact that right now the president realizes he has a media narrative problem that he needs to get in front of in some kind of way. And this is the part that I find the most ticklish, Lawrence. You know, Trump is talking about this lowlife in Omarosa. Well, he created this lowlife. That's like Frankenstein after creating his monster looking and going, well, you're a monster. And he's like, yeah, I mean, I am your creation. So, you know, a lot of this right now is coming up around the president's heels in a way that I think he's being bested to some degree by his own creation. And it is a little bit amusing to watch.
Yamiche, I think one line we're not going to hear in a Trump reelection campaign is, I get the best people, I hire the best people. And this is a crucially important factor when you're looking at this administration's response to the devastation in Puerto Rico, to their own inability to repair the damage that they did themselves on the southern border. Over 500 kids tonight separated from their parents, and this administration has said in court, we don't know how to put those families back together.
Well, I'll say this. I've talked to immigration lawyers who are very, very worried that the parents who were deported without their kids may never be able to be reunited with those kids, or that the United States will drag their feet for years and years, and it might be years of trauma with these children before they see their children again, or their parents again. The thing I'll say, though, is that the White House is still not put out a list of African-American staffers in the White House. So as of right now, it seems as though there's not one black senior staffer in the White House. I've talked to a lot of black Republicans who say that they had people that wanted to work for this White House. Michael Steele has said that Omarosa blocked some of those people from going in. On top of that, you have an administration where Ben Carson has decided to raise the rent on a lot of poor people who are looking for federal subsidies. At the DOJ, you have Jeff Sessions looking at ending affirmative action, also looking at possibly extending prison terms. So this is an administration that, if you look at it, they would say that they're champions of civil rights, but people like the NAACP that have called the president outright a racist say that not only in the president's rhetoric, but also in his policies and who he's chosen not to hire, he's shown that he's not interested in civil rights.
Michael Steele, Donald Trump saying triumphantly that Mark Burnett called to say there are no tapes. And there's something about the claiming that there are no tapes so excitedly that gives you the feeling that the person who's so excited that there are no tapes may be worried that there was some possibility
that there are tapes
in the years of that show that there might be a tape.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Look, you know, those sets, you know, people sitting there around talking, and the backstory on these particular tapes in this situation was, you know, there were in between shots, and the president was commenting very openly and very freely, and we know the president does that. We've seen him do that. We've heard him do that, and he's gotten in trouble before in doing that. So I think back in the recesses of his mind, he's hoping the camera wasn't rolling, but probably believes in the end it was, and that's why you see the kind of concern in the tapes in the tweets that he's putting out right now.
And Tim, it is Donald Trump's case here tonight, as of today, that Omarosa was incompetent. She was completely incompetent, doing a terrible job all the time. He is emphasizing this. He is emphasizing the incompetence within his own administration, and again, shining a light on a book that he doesn't want people to read and he doesn't want people to believe. We've seen him do this with the other critical...
With the Michael Wolff book.
Michael Wolff book.
Right, yeah, and he's also surrounded by people who are duplicit. And he himself is duplicit. And when someone's trying to build a team and they themselves aren't honorable and can't really attract confident, capable people, you end up with everybody backbiting. And that's what you're seeing with this group right now. I think one of the reasons the President of the United States, rather than paying attention to the country's business tonight, thinking about the fact that there's a financial crisis in Turkey, that children are being ripped from their parents at the southern border, he's tweeting about a reality show contestant obsessively all day long because he feels betrayed.
And he doesn't have one person, as far as we know, working in that White House trying to reunite those families that they separated at the southern border. Tim O'Brien, Yamiche Alcindor, and Michael Steele, thank you very much for starting us off tonight. Really appreciate this.
Absolutely.
And when we come back, Donald Trump has a new explanation and what he thinks is a defense of the Trump Tower meeting with Russians during the presidential campaign. But it's not a very strong defense of Donald Trump Jr. In a statement obviously written for him by his criminal defense lawyers, President Trump told the Washington Post this about Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting with Russians at Trump Tower during the presidential campaign. Don has received notoriety for a brief meeting that many politicians would have taken, but most importantly, and to the best of my knowledge, nothing happened after the meeting concluded. The lawyerly phrase, to the best of my knowledge, certainly leaves open the possibility that something did happen after the Trump Tower meeting that President Trump claims he does not know about. This is the latest version of Donald Trump's many attempts to explain away that meeting. The first lies that Donald Trump masterminded about the meeting was that it was all about adoptions. Another significant development in the Trump defense strategy is the revelation that we now know the president's version of what James Comey says was the incriminating conversation in which President Trump tried to block the FBI's investigation of the first Trump National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. James Comey says that the president asked him, I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. Donald Trump's version of the conversation is that the conversation never happened.
Flynn. The president says he never told Comey that he should go easy on Flynn.
I just want to be clear exactly what happened in that conversation with Comey about Michael Flynn. What exactly did President Trump say?
There was no conversation about Michael Flynn.
So you're saying that President Trump and James Comey never discussed Michael Flynn?
That is what he will testify to if he's asked that question.
Joining our discussion now, David Frum, senior editor for The Atlantic and author of Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republican, and Mimi Rocah, former federal prosecutor and former assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. She's also an MSNBC contributor. And Mimi, let's start first with what Rudy Giuliani said. There was no discussion of Michael Flynn. That may be the only workable defense strategy. Rather than get into, I didn't say that, I said this, just, oh, no, we never discussed it.
It's probably the best strategy for him, but it's too little too late. I mean, at this point, first of all, even Giuliani has gone on TV. I think Trump has even acknowledged that there were conversations, but tried to explain them away, right? And so this is what happens with everything that comes out with them. You have this evolution where it starts with, no, usually it starts with, no, it didn't happen. And then once there are irrefutable facts, they come out and say, well, okay, but it wasn't illegal. That's like the Trump Tower meeting and the contact with the Russians. Here, we've kind of done the reverse. I think they didn't quite realize how bad it was going to be. And so they said, yeah, well, he had a conversation, but that was what Giuliani has said on TV previously, right? That was one of the things. Yeah. Said, well, it's okay for him to say that about Flynn to Comey. And also because I don't think they correctly determined that it'd be very hard, whatever else you can say about Jim Comey, to make him look like a liar. And Comey was smart enough to have some corroboration. So they went from, yes, this happened, it wasn't a big deal, to now saying, backtracking completely and saying it just doesn't work. Now, we're not in a court of law, but certainly in any kind of official proceeding, you can't keep changing your story like that. hopefully the public has as little tolerance for it here as juries do in courtrooms, because that's what we're dealing with now. And jurors get it in courtrooms.
In a legal proceeding, can you pull out, I know you can pull out former sworn statements like depositions, under oath statements, but can you pull out a news article and say, look, in here, the president said, I never said that?
Well, a public statement outside of a courtroom, it depends. If it's of the defendant or the person being charged, then yes, because it wouldn't be hearsay, not to get too in the weeds here. So yes, if he made a prior statement, that was inconsistent with something now, they could say, well, in the right context, they could use it as an admission. Yes, but even more so when people make inconsistent arguments, within a courtroom. So like at a trial and a defense attorney gets up and says, well, it didn't happen, but even if it didn't happen, he didn't really have the intent, he didn't mean it. Juries hate that. And that's what they're doing now. And juries don't buy it, when it's happening there. And I'm hoping the American public doesn't buy it, in this courtroom, that we're a public courtroom.
And David, so the president has gone from defending the meeting at Trump Tower during the campaign, saying it was all about adoptions, to now saying, okay, we all know what it was about. But now they're saying most politicians would have had the meeting. They used to say Trump used to say every politician would have had a meeting with a foreign power to get dirt on the opponent. And now the president seems to be concerned with nothing other than what did the president know after the meeting occurred?
Ernest Hemingway has a famous line that when you go broke, at first it's very slow, and then it's very fast. And the same is true for the emergence of truth. I think a lot of people who watch your program have this feeling like this story never seems to, I mean, they're on top of it, they follow every nuance, but the story never seems to move. But when a series of major presidential statements about a national security event, like cooperating allegedly with a foreign power, when that statement begins to unravel, the unraveling program, it is like a sandcastle collapsing before the waves. I mean, at first it's very slow, and then suddenly it's just gone. And that's what that, to the best of my knowledge. On this point about, the president now attempting to deny, or his lawyer attempting to deny, that he ever talked to Comey about obstruction. This is a place where the comedy element of tonight's program and the serious element overlap, because the president's now claiming, just before you went on the air, that he had this conversation with Mark Burnett. Now, at Mark Burnett TV has a Twitter account of his own. In fact, it's at Mark Burnett TV. I imagine he also employs publicists. If he wanted to release a statement to the president, he would release a statement. In fact, he should release a president. In fact, the first thing the president would say to him if that conversation took place was, please release a statement to that effect. The fact that the president tweeted it tells you that the conversation did not take place. And that's, as you say, one of dozens of examples where conversations don't take place. The conversation with Comey is the most important conversation probably of his presidency. And he is now going to ask the American people to believe him and not James Comey's contemporaneous notes. And he's going to ask that just minutes after inventing a conversation with Mark Burnett.
When you see the president's new statement about the Trump Tower meeting during the campaign, how does that change the legal posture of the Trump position about that meeting?
Right. Well, so he's trying to bring in, or he's trying to say he didn't know what happened after, Trump, doesn't know what happened after the meeting. So he's trying to build in some distance.
Oh, and by the way, let's just get in here. He also does not say in this latest version that he didn't know about it before.
Right.
And that's the latest round of accusations from Michael Cohen, that Donald Trump knew about it before. So he doesn't even touch that now.
Right. And he's also, we now know, admitted that the meeting was about getting dirt on his opponent from the Russians. That was like last week's Twitter. Yeah. So now we're at, okay, this happened. It was to get dirt, but nothing happened afterwards that Donald Trump, knew about. It doesn't even really make a lot of sense. I mean, he's clearly trying to put some distance there, and someone advised him that knowledge is relevant, and that's correct. Knowledge is relevant, but it isn't knowledge at that point. That's not the only point at which his knowledge becomes relevant. If he knew about the meeting ahead of time, they went to the meeting. First of all, whether or not anything happened afterwards, there can still be a crime. I mean, conspiracy is a crime that does not need to have a fully completed act afterwards. It's about an agreement. That is the crime. And second of all, a lot did happen after that meeting. So the whole statement is preposterous, right? I mean, they actually released emails afterwards, and Trump asked for more emails. So it's preposterous to say that nothing happened afterwards.
Yeah, David, to that point, that nothing happened afterwards, everything happened afterwards.
That's so exactly correct. Thank you for making that point. There's a big there's a big WikiLeaks dump in June. There's a big WikiLeaks dump in October within 45 minutes of the release of the Access Hollywood tape. And Mueller's latest indictment makes clear that the Russians were continually present in Democratic servers through that period between June and October and may have stolen Democratic Party analytics. Now, we still don't know what the Russians did with those stolen Democratic Party analytics, but that would be very useful information for a campaign that had half as much money to spend as the Hillary Clinton campaign, and as we have seen again tonight, was not exactly employing competent professionals.
Mimi Rocah and David Frum, thank you for guiding us through the investigation again tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And when we come back, the most unpopular Republican president since Richard Nixon, will he be challenged for the Republican nomination for president? And will Ohio Governor John Kasich be that challenger? The votes are still being counted in the Ohio 12th Congressional District special election, where 1,564 votes separate the Republican and Democrat. But President Trump is already claiming it as a victory and using it to attack his Republican rival, Ohio Governor John Kasich. The president tweeted, "The very unpopular governor of Ohio and failed presidential candidate John Kasich hurt Troy Balderson's recent win by tamping down enthusiasm for an otherwise great candidate. Even Kasich's lieutenant governor lost governor race because of his unpopularity. Credit to Troy on the big win," which is, of course, not yet a win. That is the exact opposite of what happened, according to some experts. Here is Cook political report analyst Dave Wasserman. In the end, Franklin County cast impressive 35% of the Ohio 12th vote and came through big for O'Connor. Turnout was weak in heavily Republican rurals, but Balderson held on to enough traditional Republican suburbs in Delaware County, likely thanks to Governor Kasich. The most recent poll of Donald Trump's approval rating in Ohio shows that only 39% of Ohio voters have a favorable view of President Trump, while 58.6% view him unfavorably. In that same poll, 42.4% of voters had a favorable view of John Kasich, with just 34.8% viewing him unfavorably. And with John Kasich obviously more popular than Donald Trump in the key swing state of Ohio, what does that mean for a possible John Kasich challenge to Donald Trump for the Republican presidential nomination? And here is the one thing that we know about presidents who get challenged within their own parties for renomination, for their reelection. Just by being challenged, they end up losers in the general election. More on that next. The easiest thing to say when you are a Republican and there is a Republican in the White House running for re-election, the easiest thing for a Republican to say then is, "I am not running for president." But John Kasich just can't bring himself to say that.
I don't know what I'm doing. You know that. What I'm doing now is, look, I'm staying alive. I'm speaking out. But every time I say anything or observe something, people want to say, oh, well, that's because he's running for president. Right. I really don't know what I'm going to do. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. I don't know.
David Frum and Michael Steele are back with us. And Michael, sometimes I don't know means yes.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, in most cases, it typically does, at that level especially. You know, John Kasich, I think, has made no secret that he has at least his sights on the possibility of laying down the tracks for the presidency. In fact, he and Governor Hickenlooper, if you recall, Lawrence, were out and about several months ago as a tandem, talking about the possibility of a bipartisan ticket to some degree and in some way. So it's very clear he's sending the signals that he at least wants to look at the prospect of mixing things up in the Republican primary in 2020, which will be a very interesting prospect. The history, as you noted at the top, is not all that good for an incumbent president when that happens, and maybe that's the end game after all.
Yeah, David, from in 68, before anyone thought it was even conceivable that it could happen, we saw Senator Eugene McCarthy, Democrat, step out, run against Democratic President Lyndon Johnson, followed by Bobby Kennedy. So 2 Democrats running against the Democratic President Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson ultimately just gave up. We cut to about 24 years later. Pat Buchanan runs against the incumbent Republican President George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush holds on to the nomination and goes on to defeat in the general election. There's no good model here for the president who gets challenged by a serious challenger within his own party.
That's very true, and you are the leading authority on 1968. It's also true there aren't really great models for the challenger. On the Republican side, the primary challenge everyone thinks of is 1976, Reagan versus Ford. But in that case, the party was already really split. Reagan found something that was already there. What John Kasich would be asked to do here is to take a party that is shrunken but still united behind Donald Trump and embark on what really is probably a martyr mission for himself.
But, Michael, how would you compare it to the Buchanan run, which looked hopeless from the start, surprised us with its strength, but ultimately it died in the primary season? And then George H.W. Bush could never quite recover from that to go on to what was expected by most observers to be the re-election of an incumbent president.
Well, I think it goes to something David just referenced, and that is the challenge of finding something that's there. And Pat Buchanan, very much like Donald Trump in his chaotic rise within the party, found something that was there, and he struck that nerve, and he used it as a weapon against the incumbent, George Bush. Same is true in 1980 with Jimmy Carter and Senator Kennedy. Kennedy found something inside the Democratic Party that was there, couldn't fully exploit it, and that's the Achilles heel for the challenger. The ability to fully exploit it to the point where you get voters within the base to turn their head away from the incumbent and toward the challenger. Whether they like the incumbent or not, most times, Lawrence, as you know, there's just this fealty, this loyalty, because that's our standard bearer, and you just have this fear that if we look the other way, that we could lose. Well, the act of the challenge itself is already set in motion the prospects of losing, because the rest of the country is watching that and forming an opinion typically against the incumbent.
Thank you for getting the Ted Kennedy challenge of Jimmy Carter in there to complete the lineup of our experience with this. David Frum, John Kasich seems to like the fight so far. Donald Trump attacks him. He replies with a tweet that's just a picture of Vladimir Putin laughing. He has put Donald Trump's attack in a fundraising solicitation that he's put out there. He's trying to raise money from Republican supporters on the basis that Donald Trump is attacking him.
Right. Well, he faces a dilemma because he could certainly hurt Donald Trump. But the more it becomes clear that he wants to hurt Donald Trump, the harder it is for him to proceed in the Republican primary. If he's going to replace Donald Trump, then he needs to come up with an alternative vision. And the alternative vision that would replace Donald Trump in this Republican Party as we have it now in 2019 and 2020 is going to be one that is not the message that John Kasich has been articulating over the past 2 or 3 years.
David Frum, Michael Steele, thank you both for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Tonight's Last Word is next. Time for tonight's Last Word.
Rudy Giuliani, he's got a new offer for Bob Mueller that Trump is willing to sit down to do the interview, but some topics have to be off limits, like why Trump fired Comey, what Trump said to Comey, and anything to do with obstruction of justice. My client has nothing to hide as long as you don't ask him about the things he wants to hide.
Once again, comedy says it best. Bill Maher gets tonight's last word.
Hey, it's Chris Hayes from MSNBC. You know, every day I come to the office and we make a television show. And every day I think to myself, there's so much more I want to talk about. And so this is our podcast. It's called Why Is This Happening? And the whole idea behind it is to get to the root of the things that we see play out every day. They're driven by big ideas. Each week, I sit down with a person uniquely suited to explain why this is happening.
New episodes of Why Is This Happening? Every Tuesday. Listen for free wherever you get your podcasts.